Hello. Today we're going to be doing some horoscopes around the full moon in Pisces. Um, this is an interesting full moon, first of all, because if you remember when all this sort of lockdown coronavirus mania first kicked off, I remember that was when we had a full moon in Virgo. So this full moon kind of marks the 6 month or halfway around the year point since all the lockdown stuff hit, at least around where I live in Canada here. Um, so the first one I'm looking at is Aries. Now, Aries is an interesting case because Aries has Mars in Aries, Mars, the ruler of Aries, in the first house. And about a week from now, I think the actual date is around September 9th, or about a week from the full moon, anyways, the Mars is going to go retrograde, and it's going to be stuck there in Aries for a long time, going retrograde, because Mars retrograde cycles tend to be fairly long compared to the other planets. I mean, compared to like a Mercury retrograde, a Mars retrograde is a lot longer, drawn out kind of thing. And Mars retrograde is going to be engaging with these difficult squares to Saturn, Pluto, and Jupiter and Capricorn. So when we're talking about Aries rising and Mars being the ruler of the ascendant in the first house there's a sort of a critical process going on that has to do with the self-identity of the individual and how, who are you and what are you all about in relation to the world around you. And with the chart ruler doing the retrograde in the first house like that, that's going to be a kind of a big, long drawn out reconfiguring process that's going to be hitting off lots of tensions, particularly if you look at the 10th house topics there of career and what you're doing for work. If you look at the Sun and Mercury in Virgo, sixth house over there, that has to do with kind of manual labor or grunt work, or could also do with exercise and health. But what we have there is Mercury is in a pretty good position. It's close to the Sun, but I mean, it's 13 degrees away from the Sun, and that is that would be considered to be under the beams. But since Mercury is and it's the sign of both its exaltation and its domicile, that gives it the sort of protection from being in the same sign as the Sun, and it's actually pretty well empowered Mercury there. So having a nice boost from the Sun and a nicely empowered Mercury in the sixth house could maybe could be some certain things that happen that could be either like tweaks around like health and exercise, self-care. It could also have to do with just putting in like the hard work in an area that the sixth house is kind of like work that's not necessarily fun or gratifying, or like it's kind of like the dirty jobs that just need to get done. It could be a good time for like just putting in the grunt work basically in that kind of work, and that is in a trine aspect to Capricorn because they're both earth signs. So during this kind of process, you might see something of like if you can put in the unglamorous grunt work, then that might pay off in kind of the bigger career aspect right now. However, there are some other tensions coming up around that area. If you notice, at the time of this full moon, Venus is exactly opposite Saturn. So there's something about the opposition. I mean, usually with 10th and 4th, we talk about the home life versus the work life and the balance between those two. So that could be something that's coming up here. There's something Venus and Cancer. There could be something about the the fourth house having to do with the lockdown, if you're spending more time at home, and then that creating kind of a boundary or an obstacle with the career and what you do for work. That could be another kind. It could be like Venus kind of coming up against the wall of Saturn there, and and but again, Venus is in a sextile there to Mercury, so maybe there's something like some sort of like grunt work, tedious, mundane work you can still get done from home if you're not like, if somehow the lockdowns affect being like out in the public. That could be something with that big lineup in Capricorn, could be kind of like a bit of a blockage around public life, but you might be doing more behind the scenes right now, maybe. Um, with the full moon in the 12th house, there's something to look out for, because the 12th house typically has to do with the house of self undoing, or getting into trouble. And but it's kind of interesting because it's sort of offset with the opposition with the Sun and Mercury in the 6th house, which is pretty well dignified. But the kind of it's sort of like that could be the shadow if you're trying to like clean up your act and get your, maybe do some tweaks around health or something like that, or put in the work. It's sort of like there could be this kind of the shadow that is cast from that, or the where you're falling short, or where you kind of mess up or something like that, or you don't quite get things straightened out, then it could sort of like create a mess for you. And that kind of that I'm kind of going away from using the outer planets so much, but Neptune is there too, so there could be a kind of like kind of boundary dissolving disillusion with Neptune, however that plays out in the 12th. Like, it might be a good idea to, like, part of the self-care could be a kind of like, meditation retreat kind of thing, if you want to get the higher frequency of the moon and Neptune in the 12th. But it could also be like, you could be working too hard and then you make sloppy mistakes, or you're working too hard and you just want to, like, get wasted after work, so you can blow some steam off, and then you get in trouble from that somehow. That could be a very, full moon in Pisces kind of thing. But I think if you kind of play off the strengths of that Mercury in the 6th house, then maybe that can sort of like help to mitigate some of the problems that could be coming up, particularly from the Mars squares and the full moon in the 12th. That's kind of what I'm looking at for Aries right now. I think, for the sake of keeping this organized, I'm just going to do the fire signs all in one go and then put that up as a video. So I'll skip now to Leo. So I got some notes here too. So with Leo, you're talking about the 2nd house, 8th house axis with the full moon. And so, like, as we were saying with Mercury in Virgo, is in its own domicile and is a particularly favorable position. The 2nd house has to do with wealth and money, and particularly what you can earn for yourself. And that is trining to Capricorn, the house of the 6th house. So there could be some pretty, like, again, the 6th house topics of that sort of manual grunt work and stuff like that coming up, or addressing various health issues and stuff like that. There's something, though, that it looks, though, that there's something where there's a way to kind of like work with that around the full moon for some kind of a profitable outcome, with that well dignified Mercury giving a trine to it. With it could also be even something like if there's a way to get benefits from work, or like pensions or disabilities or things like that. It could, with that Saturn there, that Saturn could represent some sort of like infirmity in the 6th house, and the Mercury could be like getting some kind of a monetary gain out of that, or something like that. Or there's it could also be if sixth house also has to do with employees. So if you're in a position where you're like hiring other people or paying other people to do work, there could be some way to sort of like have a profitable outcome out of that, perhaps. It's getting, but you've got the eighth house here, where the full moon is in the eighth, and the eighth has to do with either losses or debts or dependencies or something. And if you notice, it's also that's kind of sextiling by sign, anyways. So that stuff in the sixth. So it could be like if you're an employer and you have to pay off some people, you've got some outstanding debts or something like that. That might be something to look into. It could also be, like, I think it could be a good time for just sort of settling financial things, seeing who you're owing money to, and what kind of work needs to be done to pay that off and stuff like that. That could be part of it. What's interesting too is that the full moon is happening while there's an exact trine between the sun and Uranus in the 10th. So this could be like a major change happening around work and career as all this happens. Um, Venus is there in the 12th house, opposing that Saturn in the 6th. So there could be some kind of, like I was saying, some sort of health condition or infirmity with that Saturn in the 6th house, and it's getting like I kind of see it like with Venus in the 12th there. The 12th house often has to do with hospitals, right? So it could be like maybe you wind up in a hospital, but then make friends with the nursing staff or like other patients in the hospital, or you maybe you're like, it could be if you go into like let's say rehab, or you go into like Alcoholics Anonymous. It's like you're kind of dealing with a troubling issue, but then you can find friends that are supporting, that have also but it's sort of like the 12th house is kind of like you've kind of messed up, or that you're kind of in some kind of recovery maybe, but you're having some kinds of friends who come in and kind of like help you out with whatever you're struggling with. So it might not be entirely a bad thing having that Venus in the 12th there. It's getting, both the 12th and the 6th are getting squared by that Mars in the ninth house. And so there's something that Mars in the ninth is slowing down and going retrograde, and there's a big square there between the 6th and the ninth. And I think it could be something really of like, sometimes when the big lessons come not from like success, but like in having to like surrender. And I'm just kind of thinking about like the Ram Dass stuff, about how Ram Dass, when he had his stroke, it was like he could see the grace in that, but it was also such a letdown, because it was like he was used to, let's say, like going golfing, right, or going traveling and doing all these kinds of things, and now he's just like, he can barely even speak, and he's confined to a wheelchair, and you're very dependent on other people and stuff like that. And so but that something about like how when you have that kind of like personal agency taken away, then that can actually be a big teacher in a way, right? So I think there's stuff that over the course of the next, from here to the end of the year, Mars is going to be retrograde in the ninth house, and that's going to be like an opportunity for a kind of a long drawn out, it could be really damn aggravating at times, right? But it's sort of like when it's like having to deal with something like, a bad back, or like a nagging pain, that like it's like that, like sometimes the most aggravating things can like be the kind of the catalyst which kind of like ferments, or like a starts a kind of a process of becoming more awake or more aware about something. And I think that could be like some of the good outcomes here for Leo, looking at this full moon. Moving on, I'm going to go to Sagittarius rising. So you've got the 10th house, 4th house axis with the full moon here. Full moon, the sun and Mercury are well dignified in the 10th house, so it's a good time to be, getting your act together for whatever your daily, workaday life or your career orientation is. But that's coming into an opposition with the moon and Neptune there in the 4th house. So the full moon is it's sort of like you're looking at is the home life and the work life kind of harmonized together. And with the context of the lockdown, there's a question of like, are you working outside are you going out to work, or are you working from home, basically, right? And if you're working from home, it's sort of like, how does the home life support the endeavors of the work life, and is that a good balance there? Or if you're like, if you're a parent, you got like the Mars in the 5th house there, like maybe you're trying to like do a Zoom meeting, but your toddler keeps crying and interrupting it or something like that, and it's thrown the whole thing off, right? And then you got that square, right? The square from the 5th to the 2nd, and then you just lost a client and you're not making as much money because you got to sort out something with the 5th house, which I'm using this as like, the terrible twos toddler as the cranky Mars and Aries baby, disrupting the situation. But it could be other things as well. The 5th house has to do with like, could also be what do you do for fun or something like that. And it could also, when you see the square between the 2nd and the 5th, it's sort of like, is your hobbies, is your play, it can one for the big thing between 2nd and 5th, can you afford it, for one thing? Is it helping, are your endeavors profitable, or are you just sort of like losing money on them? Are they helping you or hindering you, that kind of thing? And is getting a square from Venus in the 8th house. So that could be like, I think it works. It kind of makes sense looking at it as like a parenting thing. Like it could be the Venus in the 8th house could be like the babysitter you're dependent on. Like maybe you're dependent on a babysitter, but like the babysitter is like, there's some sort of conflict that comes up there, and then you can't, like, you got to find a new one or something like that. And then in the meantime, that's interrupting the work at home life stuff. I mean, this is all a hypothetical situation from like an imaginary Sagittarius chart, but those are the kind of tensions that are coming up for Sagittarius around right now. And if it's not kids, you could be like, what is your, what creative project are you working on that's kind of like your baby in a way? And like, do you have, and how is that supported, either from you're leaning on others, or how you can support yourself to kind of give birth to your own creative vision? And because that Mars is going retrograde, that kind of like creative impulse or mojo is kind of like slowing down right now, and is going to be going through this kind of long drawn out, working through all these obstacles, or making sure you've got the resources to do what you got to do. That's going to be a big one for Sag rising. And this concludes the horoscopes for the fire signs.